All right, so let's pick up where we left off. And let's talk about transatlantic trade. People, ideas, and goods flowed back and forth across the Atlantic, knitting together the empire and its diverse populations: British merchants and consumers, American colonists, African slaves, and surviving Indians, and creating webs of interdependence among the European empires. Sugar, tobacco, and other products of the Western Hemisphere were marketed as far away as Eastern Europe. London bakers financed the slave trade between Africa and Portuguese Brazil. Spain spent its gold and silver importing goods from other countries. As trade expanded, the North American and West Indian colonies became the major overseas market for British manufactured goods. Although most colonial output was consumed at home, North Americans shipped farm products to Britain, the West Indies, and some went outside the empire. Membership in the empire had many advantages for colonists. Most Americans did not complain about British regulation of their trade because commerce enriched the colonies as well as the mother country, and lax enforcement of the Navigation Acts allowed smuggling to flourish. Indeed, it is important to note that despite the many differences between life in England and its colonies, 18th century English America drew closer and closer to, and in some ways became more and more similar to, the mother country, especially when you look at its class system, which I want to briefly mention. In the mainland, southern colonies like Virginia and South Carolina had developed wealthy planter classes. Planters in Virginia, like George Washington and Edmund Pendleton, not only owned land and slaves, but also held key positions in society and control of the provincial government. During the first half of the century, Britain adopted a policy of salutary neglect toward the colonies, leaving them largely to govern themselves. With imperial authority so weak, the large landowners, merchants, and lawyers who dominated colonial assemblies increasingly claimed the right to control local politics. South Carolina's planters were the richest of the mainland colonies. Colonial elites prided themselves on developing aristocratic manners, cultivating the arts, and making productive use of leisure. Indeed, on both sides of the Atlantic, elites viewed work as something reserved for common folk and slaves. Freedom from labor was the mark of a gentleman. In the South, the wealthy took part in privileged activities such as parties, gambling, and receiving a college education. Throughout the colonies, elites emulated what they saw as England's balanced, stable social order. Liberty, in their eyes, meant in part the power to rule, the right of those blessed with wealth and prominence to dominate over others. They viewed society as a hierarchical structure in which some men were endowed with greater talents than others and destined to rule. The social order, they believed, was held together by webs of influence and linked patrons and those dependent on them. At the other end of the social scale, poverty emerged as a visible feature of 18th century colonial life. Although not considered by most colonists to be part of their society, the growing number of slaves lived in impoverished conditions. Among free Americans, poverty was less widespread as it was in England. But as the colonial population expanded, access to land diminished rapidly, especially in long-settled areas. Attitudes and policies toward poverty in colonial America mirrored British precedents. The better off generally viewed the poor as lazy, shiftless, and responsible for their own plight. Both rural and urban communities did accept responsibility for assisting their own, but to minimize the burden on taxpayers, the poor were frequently sent to labor in workhouses, where they produced goods that reimbursed authorities for their upkeep. Their children were sent to work as apprentices in local homes and workshops. Most communities adopted stringent measures to ward off employees and propertyless newcomers. This involved town authorities either expelling the unwanted poor from the area or formally declaring some persons ineligible for assistance. The large majority of Americans lived between the extremes of wealth and poverty, along with racial and ethnic diversity. What distinguished the mainland colonies from Europe was the wide distribution of land and the economic autonomy of most ordinary free families. Perhaps two-thirds of the free male population were farmers who owned their own land. By the 18th century, colonial farm families viewed land ownership almost as a right and as a social precondition of freedom. They strongly resented efforts by Native Americans, great landlords, or colonial governments to limit their access to land. A dislike of personal dependence and an understanding of freedom as not relying on others for a livelihood sank deep roots in British North America. As the population grew and the death rate declined, family life stabilized and more marriages became lifetime commitments. Free women were expected to devote their lives to being good wives and mothers. Already enshrined in law and property relations, male dominance took on greater and greater social reality. In several colonies, the law mandated primogeniture, meaning that estates must be passed intact to the oldest son. In the 18th century, the division of labor along gender lines solidified. Women's work was clearly defined, including cooking, cleaning, sewing, making butter, like this woman here, and assisting with agricultural chores. The work of farmers' wives and daughters often spelled the difference between self-sufficiency and poverty. Women's work is never done is a popular adage that was literally true during this period. Even as the Consumer Revolution reduced the demands on many women by making available store-bought goods previously produced at home, women's work seemed to increase. Lower infant mortality meant more time spent in childcare and domestic chores. The demand for new goods increased the need for all family members to contribute to family income. For most women, work was incessant and exhausting. "I am dirty and distressed, almost wearied to death," wrote Mary Cooper, a Long Island woman, in her diary in 1769. "This day," she continued, "is 40 years since I left my father's house and come here, and here have I seen little else but hard labor and sorrow." To sum up this discussion on social life in the colonies, I will say this. By the mid-18th century, the area that would become the United States was home to a remarkable diversity of peoples and different kinds of social organization. In the British colonies, writes one historian, lived thousands of the freest individuals the Western world has ever known. Yet many others found themselves confined to the partial freedom of indentured servitude or to the complete absence of freedom in slavery. Both concepts and practices of freedom and unfreedom had been essential to the North American colony's rapid development. Let's talk about politics. This is the House of Burgesses in Virginia. By the 1750s, semi-permanent political parties competed vigorously for popular support in New York elections. But in most other colonies, although differences over policies of one kind or another were hardly absent, they rarely produced the civil disorder or political passions of the previous century. In many respects, politics in 18th century America had a more democratic quality than in Great Britain. Suffrage requirements varied from colony to colony, but as in Britain, the linchpin of voting laws was the property qualification. Requiring property ownership for voting ensured that men who had an economic stake in society and the independence of judgment that came with it determined the policies of the government. The wide distribution of property in the colonies meant that a far higher percentage of the population enjoyed voting rights compared to their British counterparts. It is estimated that between 50 and 80% of adult white men could vote in 18th century colonial America, as opposed to fewer than 5% in Britain at the time. Despite the broad electorate among white men, the people only really existed on election day. Between elections, members of colonial assemblies remained out of touch with their constituents. Strongly competitive elections were the norm in the middle colonies, and elsewhere many elections went uncontested, either because only one candidate presented himself, or the local culture stressed community harmony, like many New England towns. Appointed individuals such as governors and councils, who were given their positions by the crown or colony proprietors, held far more power than those who were elected. Moreover, laws passed in colonial assemblies could be vetoed by governors in London. During the 18th century, many educated Americans began to be influenced by the outlook of the European Enlightenment. This philosophical movement, which originated among the French thinkers and soon spread to Britain, sought to apply the scientific method of careful investigation based on research and experiment to political and social life. Enlightenment ideas crisscrossed the Atlantic along with goods and people. Enlightenment thinkers insisted that every human institution, authority, and tradition be judged before the bar of reason. The self-educated Benjamin Franklin's widely circulated publication, Poor Richard's Almanac, which you see here, was full of experiments conducted to demonstrate that lightning is a form of electricity. His work exemplified the Enlightenment spirit and made him probably the best-known American in the 18th century. One inspiration for the American Enlightenment was a reaction against the bloody religious wars that racked Europe in the 17th century. Enlightenment thinkers hoped that reason, not religious enthusiasm, could govern human life. Enlightenment thought also influenced religion, with thinkers believing that religious belief should rest on scientific evidence. During the 18th century, many prominent Americans moved toward the position of Arminianism, which taught that reason alone was capable of establishing the essentials of religion. Others, including Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, adopted deism, a belief that God essentially withdrew after creating the world, leaving it to function according to scientific laws without divine intervention. To put it simply, think of the universe as a giant clock. To create the universe, God wound the clock and left it to function as it naturally and scientifically would. In the 17th century, the English scientist Isaac Newton had revealed the natural laws that govern the physical universe. Here, deists believed, was the purest evidence of God's handiwork. Many Protestants of all denominations could accept Newton's findings while remaining devout churchgoers, as Newton himself had. But deists concluded that the best form of religious devotion was to study the workings of nature rather than to worship in organized churches or appeal to divine grace for salvation. I'm going to pause here, and the next part we're going to talk about the Great Awakening.